Hey, everybody. Welcome to the EPM Intelligence Podcast. On today's show, we're going to be diving deep into one of the most critical and often underestimated parts of enterprise transformation, and that is enterprise data management. My guest today is Rahul Kamath, one of the thought leaders behind Oracle Enterprise Data Management, or EDM for short. Rahul has been at the center of how Oracle helps global enterprises bring order, governance, and now artificial intelligence to their data ecosystems. Rahul, it's great to have you on.
Thank you for having me, Nihar. It's a pleasure.
So, Rahul, I know we go back several years, but for those of the folks out there that might be listening that don't know you, would you mind introducing yourself?
So, I started my journey at Oracle um, several moons ago, and this was a time when we had this solution called Oracle Daily Business Intelligence, and I was asked to come in and help with address the situation around garbage in, garbage out, around our customer analytics that sat at the very top of the stack of all of the applications we delivered to market. And so from pretty much day one, I backed into the world of what were really, the challenges around information, data quality, things like that. We built our very first solution called Librarian within Oracle E-Business Suite. And then our customers came to us and said, we would really like to use your customer model to work with any application, Oracle or non-Oracle. And so that led us into the world of what came to be known as the Oracle Customer Hub. And so over the years, as we delivered these capabilities and acquired companies like Siebel and PeopleSoft, and then ultimately delivered Fusion, I was involved in our customer data management solutions. And from there, I was invited to join Hyperion, where we also had a master data management solution called Hyperion MDM. Later came to be known as Oracle Data Relationship Management, and then we reimagined that capability as part of Oracle as we moved to the cloud to bring to our customers Oracle Enterprise Data Management Cloud. And so it's been it's been a really wonderful journey in terms of helping serve customers across multiple domains and subject areas, and evolving from sort of on-premise to cloud and so on. So
Yeah, well, the task is not a light one, right? Master data management is all of the data in an organization. And, given how the role for data governance has changed throughout the technology shifts and throughout the organizational structures, EDM does get compared a lot to master data management. So for the leaders listening, how do you explain what EDM actually is and how it differs from what they think of as traditional MDM?
a great question. So when we set about circa 2015, 2016 to reimagine DRM, or data relationship management, on the cloud, we asked ourselves what were some of the Achilles heels, if you will, around that solution that we had shepherded over a decade. And we learned that from an implementation standpoint, organizations struggled with brittle business processes. They were suffering from the challenges of having um, to be able to really focus on this canonical information model, if you will, that was a bit pedantic, more so than it was practical. And we asked ourselves, what are going to be the challenges as we looked ahead to the cloud around how customers will implement? And what we realized was that customers were looking for a solution that was agile, that was incremental in nature, that was easy to configure, that was self-service in nature, and really targeted at business users so that they could, because since they were closest to change within the enterprise, they were the best folks within the organization to be able to communicate via a system like EDM in order to be able to share the changes that were occurring, to have them reviewed, enriched, and approved by other stakeholders in the organization to drive that cross-functional business process in order to build the integrity and the trust that was necessary for organizations to ultimately um, uh, be able to rely on these data sets to drive decision making and go from sort of insight to action, if you will, around those crown jewels of the enterprise. And so, by reflecting on the challenges of how things worked in the traditional MDM world, we really sort of gave birth to a brand new cloud native solution that was, coined as Oracle Enterprise Data Management, with a focus on allowing you to incrementally bring on applications within the enterprise, so you didn't have to engage in a big bang approach, so that you could really, layer in applications at your own pace to be able to, integrate them into your corporate structure, domain by domain, subject area by subject area, do so incrementally, and be able to offer end users first class experiences around how dimensions and hierarchies look like in the native applications that they used. So if I were a planner and I wanted to look at my planning dimensions, how could I come into a solution like EDM and not look at something abstract called master data, which is an amalgam of perspectives across different applications, but really just look at what I care about as a planner. And in the same vein, someone coming in from the general ledger perspective or the consolidation or the reconciliation perspective gets to see the metadata in a form that they understand best. And so, what we realized is if people are going to be able to relate to those structures, they can make the changes in the context of their own applications, which they understand best. And then we, as the application, can wire it together in a way that accepts those changes and blends them into an enterprise master that really is got this agile incremental approach embedded within it, which is going to be eventually consistent, and arrive at exactly the same sort of expectations that you might impose upon a traditional master data management solution. And so, if you think about it, the incremental approach really invites you to create mini masters. So let's say I've got 15 planning applications. I can first focus on working with planners within my FP&A organization to come together and build a perspective on what the account dimension or the cost center dimension or the product dimension ought to be across all of our planning modules. And then we could expand the universe, or maybe have parallel universes where the operational systems folks, maybe I have multiple GLs and I'm trying to engage in a GL reduction project where I'm looking to transform from, a multi-GL environment to a global single cloud ERP instance. And I can have that project actually occurring concurrent to what's going on in planning. And then over time, we could evolve that into a enterprise level initiative that allows us to reconcile all of our financial master data artifacts, if you will. And so, as you can see, just sort of how I'm going about describing it, communities of people can come together in smaller initiatives, solve problems at a grassroots level, and then evolve that very organically, incrementally, in an agile manner to create that enterprise data master that most folks talk about in traditional MDM. And so, really, we go from taking a big bang approach to master data management to taking this baby step driven approach. And that, I think, was the very first time that any vendor in the world really took this sort of fresh perspective that allowed enterprises to be more nimble, be more agile, and essentially evolve their programs at their own pace, whether they choose to build little mini masters or evolve that and sort of stick to it, or evolve that eventually to this enterprise level data master.
I think that's such an important point because, we often have the conversation with customers about when to deploy something like master data or enterprise data management. And, we've always thought of this as something that has to happen either early on, where all the definitions may not be available today because we don't have all the target applications defined, or it could be at the end once everything is done. But by then, the appetite to deploy something is not always there, or, they're just so used to the way that they're of doing things that they may not, have a lot of internal motivation. So the fact that you can kind of crawl, walk, run, and then fly at your own pace, I think is a really compelling proposition for customers that may have shied away from MDM projects, but are now able to do so in a more, eating the elephant one bite at a time kind of manner rather than having to do it all at once. How does EDM fit into the broader Oracle ecosystem? You kind of touched on this from a finance perspective, like things like planning and budgeting or consolidations and reconciliations. But is there an example, maybe even a customer story without naming any names if you don't feel comfortable, but definitely an example where EDM has made a measurable difference outside of traditional finance and accounting master data?
Absolutely. So the journey of EDM has been one in which we had to start somewhere, right? In terms of delivering a whole solution, And given some of our roots in the office of the CFO, we decided that we wanted to solve for that particular design point to begin with. And so when we brought EDM to market in January of 2018, our focus was very much on serving that office of the CFO audience, right? And so we worked diligently to deliver a whole solution by delivering packaged integrations and being able to, sort of pre-package application metadata for transactional systems as well as the analytical EPM applications to give customers the ability to manage their chart of accounts, to manage their analytical dimensions, hierarchies, and data maps and the like to serve that particular audience. But finance and analytical applications, by definition, tend to not presuppose what the dimensions are going to be. So if I'm looking to do planning, I may be engaging in planning in the context of workforce planning or project planning or financial statement planning and capex planning, things like that. But then I might also be looking at building models around revenue planning or my marketing campaign plans and so on and so forth. So it is very much a enterprise sort of planning process, right? Similarly, on the financial chart of account side, operationally speaking, they're dealing with segments that are not known a priori until an implementation actually occurs. What that meant for us as EDM was to really define a very flexible information model where you could really model any business dimension of your choice by describing it, defining the attribution or properties, as we like to call them, specify business rules, validations, permissions, policies, and then you're off to the races in terms of throwing that application experience open to end users who can come in and start to make change requests and participate alongside their peer group, their cross-functional peer group, to be able to perform enrichment and approvals of changes, be able to pour over structures that they need to define to drive a digital transformation, or maybe perform or sort of go through a post-merger integration experience where they've got lots and lots of different structures that are coming in from the acquired systems that need to be blended into the corporate whole. So that really, gave us a great starting point to parlay ourselves into what traditionally in the MDM world might be described as a multi-domain data mastering service. And that's really been the journey of EDM, which is we sort of started in the office of the CFO, and now we've evolved into this multi-domain solution that you can steer in whatever direction you choose as an enterprise, either in the context of being able to model business entities downstream in the office of finance, or upstream from an operational perspective in terms of modeling your locations and sites. So if I'm a retailer, I might have stores I want to master. If I'm a bank, I might want to master my ATMs and bank branches. If I'm an oil and gas company, I might want to master my, oil wells, rigs, land leases, you name it. And so really what we've given customers is the flexibility to be able to model both horizontal objects, such as your locations and sites, your suppliers, projects, products, customers, and so on, and vertical objects that are unique to your particular industry or sort of functional area that you operate in. And so with that, we have found our customers really take that journey and push our boundaries in terms of building, mastering solutions for themselves in a variety of areas. So we've had, for example, an oil services company that started in the office of the CFO, engaged in a financial transformation initiative using EDM, and then they've parlayed that success into building an organization master and a facilities master. We've had a large multinational manufacturing company that started with their Hyperion metadata on premise, and then evolved that into a extensive, product hierarchy reconciliation initiative. And now they're looking at us for supplier and customer master data. We've also seen, retailers invest in EDM specifically for things like supplier mastering and site mastering. We've seen that even in the quick serve market, and so I could go on, sharing various use cases. So, for example, in the media space, we've seen companies actually master their titles inside of EDM. Others, maybe they're in they're running large businesses around selling tickets to events, and so they might master their the actual event locations, and then all of the different stakeholders involved in delivering on those events, and so whether they're bands or musicians, etc. So as you can see, the sky's the limit in terms of you're only limited by your imagination to be able to decide, hey, what is it that we see value in uniquely as an enterprise around where we can create these trusted sources of enterprise data and then share them across a variety of different applications and systems and stakeholders, both within our enterprise and maybe even amongst partners and such. So
Great. No, I appreciate that background and context because, you know, there are so many different use cases out there, and we're all sort of familiar, how it can work well in finance because finance tends to have more structured data in general. But, our customers are also asking on how we can start leveraging this across the enterprise, and the fact that you can do it in a module or in a piecemeal fashion rather than having to do it all at once, I think makes it more achievable in some of the quick turnaround times that projects are expected to perform now. One of the other topics that comes up, and I know we talked a lot about the data management component of it, but governance is just as key in having accuracy, change management. I mean, these are somewhat buzzwords, but in EDM, they seem to be very real aspects of the tool. Could you talk about how enterprise data management handles metadata accuracy, and what are some practices for maintaining accuracy and consistency that EDM provides, especially across systems and business units in an organization?
absolutely, that's a great question, and it's a big part of why customers choose EDM, right? And so, foundationally speaking, we have a rich foundation we offer within EDM around supporting business rules and validations in order to imbue your data sets with high data quality. And so, in certain areas where we have packaged integrations or out of the box adapters for, say, the Fusion ERP and EPM modules, we embed those business rules and validations for you out of the box. And then we provide you a custom validation framework in which you can also specify your own set of expressions to describe what are the business rules that are relevant to you as an enterprise that you might want to overlay, or just have for those other applications within your ecosystem for which we don't necessarily offer packaged equivalents. So you can leverage a combination of those sets of validation, business rules, etc. We also have a way of staging those rules and exposing them to end users depending upon if they are the right people to respond to those particular business rules, right? So if you think about a frontline business user submitting a request, maybe I'm a sales manager and I'm opening a new sales office in Houston, Texas, and I want to hire a set of salespersons and be able to book their expenses against that cost center. So I put in a request for that change, but I don't really know how finance would like to name that particular cost center. And so what you can do in EDM is leverage our severity framework to really stage who actually responds to that validation. We can ignore it for that initial phase where the end user, the sales manager, submits their request, but when it gets routed to a subject matter expert in finance, they might be prompted to ensure that it is named correctly, right? And so we offer you, we sort of overlay that framework for data, valid data, if you will, with the business process and the governance workflow that you would like to put in place. Now, shifting gears, let's talk a little bit about other forms of data quality. So within EDM, we've also embedded a built-in data matching engine. And so let's say you want to avoid the creation of duplicates within the system. You can also, by setting a simple conditional policy, say every time someone is actually adding a new record, route the request to the data manager so that they can run data quality on it to make sure that there are no duplicates that flow into the system. And then further to that, we have our governance framework that really allows you to enforce the data permissions and the data policies that you define at design time in a runtime context. It really invites the right stakeholders to participate in that governance workflow to come enrich the request as a subject matter expert. And you can specify policies and policy orders to then essentially have multiple policies weigh in, and it does it entirely dynamically and inferentially, because any request, if you imagine, can be very simple, such as the sales manager wanting to request a new cost center, or it could be a very complex request where I'm going through an M&A activity and I want to request new product categories to be added, and at the same time I want to do a reorganization and a data mapping of a reorganization of my team, and I want to be able to recommend account mappings between my legacy EGL and the corporate GL. And so you could imagine a very complex request which triggers a whole set of data policies around different domains as part of a single request. And so EDM really gives you the flexibility to be as simple as you would like, but also, build very complex requests. And so the value of the governance framework really is in being able to introspect the content of your request and surface the appropriate permissions and policies to drive what the workflow does for you without you having to be prescriptive about, hey, here is a set of workflow models with tasks, and here's how I want you to sequence them. EDM takes a much more dynamic approach that listens and senses and responds to whatever the changes you as an end user are submitting, and what that means in terms of the policies and permissions that ought to be triggering and driving the nature of the workflow and who looks at it next.
I just had this thought of some Bruce Lee quote when he talks about water. And he's like, water takes the shape of its container, right? Water can flow,
Right.
water can sit still. And it sounds like that's the feeling I got when you were talking about how you can dynamically, modify or massage the policies and procedures based on the natural business evolution rather than having to fit a fixed framework.
Absolutely. We're going
So
liquid.
So obviously, Oracle is 100% all in artificial intelligence now. And you've probably seen more than I have, but I've seen a few shifts where, we've seen clients go from mainframe to server client to cloud, and now it seems like AI is that next big revolution. What are some of the ways that EDM, or what are some of the ways in which EDM is evolving to support that vision, that transformation happening in the industry? And how do you think that fits into Oracle's broader strategy for artificial intelligence? Would love to hear, what the EDM team is doing in terms of AI.
That is such a critical question especially in today's day and age where, we're reading all these statistics from the likes of MIT and others about AI pilots failing and AI initiatives that are struggling due to poor data quality and things of the sort. The reality is, when you sort of look past the hype, there's probably a few root causes that emerge. The first of which is, data quality gaps, where you have incomplete data sets, duplicates, inconsistent data. And when you feed those into AI and machine learning models, they're likely to erode the model performance and the trust that you expect from those outcomes that are suggested as a result of poor inputs in the form of the data, right? So data trust has come into focus a lot. And then you have the traditional challenges that we've been dealing with in the enterprise data world around siloed data sets and them being sort of scattered across the space, and a sort of level of disorganization that doesn't help, but just occurs as part of the natural course of doing work. Another aspect that we see from a sort of business leadership or even a regulatory standpoint is, as more and more AI investments are made, enterprises are looking to understand from an explainability standpoint, why the AI is suggesting a certain course of action over another. And so having poor access or opaque lineage, if you will, can certainly hurt these AI projects. And there might also be too many projects that are optimizing for deployment and not investing enough in driving measurable business impact and results. And so there's sort of misalignment in terms of outcomes between expectation and reality. And so often these AI projects tend to fail, and then the question is asked, why did that happen, right? And so we believe that the missing ingredient for AI is very much around having a trusted AI data foundation for your crown jewels, your enterprise data, your master data, your reference data, that can provide the contextual data foundation that is needed in order to ground your AI and drive you closer to success, right? And so, from our standpoint, we see 6 areas in which we can make a contribution from an enterprise data management perspective. The first of which is really around building a trusted master data foundation, right? And that comes from investing in stewardship and driving this sort of multi-domain foundation of trusted data sets to ensure that your AI is being trained on a shared source of truth, instead of having a set of conflicting data sets. Secondly, um, enterprise data lends itself well to enterprise structures and curated hierarchies. Oftentimes, people use the term, enterprise knowledge graphs, but really what they're referring to is a sense of intelligence that is imbued within the structures and relationships amongst the data. And that intelligence manifests itself in terms of helping AI models reason better and more effectively, and allowing those agentic workflows that more and more enterprises are building to have a way of really traversing some of the business logic that's going to drive the behaviors of those agents, because we operate increasingly in a non-deterministic mode, right? In times before we sort of started to embrace AI, we've been used to very much of a deterministic approach, where it's really all about creating responses from a system that can be sort of tied down to a particular set of numbers and can be predictable. But because we're engaging more and more with generative systems and the like, it's important for us to be able to deal with some of that uncertainty. And you're working in the worlds of probabilities, and the idea is to really be on the right side of that probabilistic prediction or assessment, right? And so these enterprise structures lend themselves really well to building the relationship intelligence and underpinning to drive those agentic workflows. Next, I would say having those validated and high quality data sets within a system like EDM as a source for your AI models really provides those grounding sources of data that can facilitate the kinds of RAG models that more and more enterprises are looking to build in order to reduce the spurious or untrustworthy outputs and drive a reduction in the hallucination that you might see occurring with generative AI types of applications. And then data quality has always been foundational to our world, but the ability to score the data for things like accuracy in the context of data matching, or completeness in order to make sure that the data that we have is indeed complete based on the different dimensions that you care about within the framework and the scope of the problems that you're trying to solve for, really allows you to ensure that the data is fit for purpose before you throw it to pasture in the context of inputs, contextual data inputs for your AI models. And then lastly, on the topic of data provenance and data lineage, that often helps drive better explainability around our AI model outcomes. Having that sort of transparency and the data lineage and the provenance to support auditable and trustworthy decision making, I think is really critical as an input going into those AI models that imbues a greater level of trust in a solution like enterprise data management. So it's really about ultimately about going from trusted inputs to reliable outputs, having contextually rich data sets that drive smarter insights, transparent lineage that gives the peace of mind to our executives and regulators, building confidence in the responses coming out of our systems, and then really enabling governance at scale and allowing for a set of repeatable successes that drive us closer to predictability, despite the sort of non-deterministic set of systems that we're embracing in the world of AI.
Yeah, it's definitely a paradigm shift, going from deterministic to generative models. And it seems like although the technology continues to change, the problem's still the same from when you started your journey, garbage in, garbage out.
Right. Coming full circle here. Yeah.
Well, as we wrap up here, Rahul, if you had to give one piece of advice to an executive, chief information officer, chief financial officer, or chief executive officer who is, beginning their journey, or maybe they're migrating from another system, an on-premise system, to the cloud, and they're evaluating their enterprise data strategy, what would you suggest they look at first, or what would you think is, one critical piece of advice that may not be as intuitive, that they haven't maybe thought of yet, or something that you've seen be successful companies that have already adopted it?
Mhm. I would say, it all comes back to change management, right? Whether you're dealing with changes at the edges of your enterprise that are routine and maybe small and insignificant, or you're being subjected to major changes because of changes in your regulatory environment, or maybe because your executive, your board has decided that you really ought to focus on growth through acquisition, or you're recognizing that you want to, go fully digital, um, which is really at this point, something that most enterprises have committed to. You're going to be investing in a set of changes, big and small, and it's important to be able to harvest those changes, have an on-ramp for those changes that can consistently be applied across your entire ecosystem of applications, whether it is how you operate your business, how you report against it, or how you sort of plan your future. This is a foundational capability and muscle that every enterprise should build, and we encourage you to, evaluate a solution like EDM to help you take that journey and make it a repeatable process, to build that trusted foundation for your transformation, for your AI journey, and to help you de-risk, some of those complexities that you're confronted with as you take that transformational journey.
Excellent. Well, Rahul, it's always a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you so much for the insight today, and thank you for everything that you're doing for the ecosystem. I really appreciate your time.
My pleasure.